really leaving my life now. Because I'm not going to Verso basically. I've not been able, last year I was here.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Karin Buddha. I'm editor here at Wendy's Subway. For those of you who are coming to the space for the first time this evening, we're a library. We host readings, writing workshops, readings and panels like this one, and then we're also a small publisher. You can find our books over on that large table over there. I guess before we get started, just a couple housekeeping notes. The restroom is just around the corner there, and if you'd like to purchase one of our titles after the reading and discussion, you can just come find me. While we don't have copies of the States of the Earth here tonight, there is a QR code for a 50% discount also over on that table. So we're so thrilled for tonight's discussion and to have Mohamed here for the launch of his book, which came out earlier this week. I want to thank Verso and particularly Tim Thomas for helping to organize this evening. I also want to thank the speakers who have engaged with Mohamed's book and who are here tonight. Unfortunately, Della Subin couldn't be here tonight, but we're so happy to have Todd and Judith here. So I'll get us started by reading everyone's bios. Mohamed Amer Meziane is a philosopher, performer, and professor at Brown University after teaching for 4 years at Columbia University. He is the author of The States of the Earth, an Ecological and Racial History of Secularization, which won the Albertine Prize for Nonfiction in 2023. His second book is titled At the Edge of the Worlds, Toward a Metaphysical Anthropology. Todd Shepard is professor of history and co-director of the program for the study of women, gender, and sexuality at Johns Hopkins University. His research bears on France and its colonial empire in the 20th century. He is particularly concerned with the intersections between the history of imperialism and the histories of state institutions, national identity, and racial and sexual issues. Judith Surkis is professor of history at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, where she specializes in the history of France and the French Empire, North Africa, and gender and legal history. Her most recent book, Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, 1830 to 1930, was awarded the 2020 Book Prize by the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. Her current work, The Intimate Life of International Law, explores how family law contests across the Mediterranean after decolonization shaped debates about secularism, feminism, religion, and race in France and Algeria. So now I'll turn it over to Mohamed to introduce and read from the book, followed by a conversation.
Right, thank you. So obviously, hello everyone. Obviously I can't read from the book because I don't have the book with me. but I'll certainly talk about the book. So hello everyone, and thanks for coming here. I'm since we're going to talk so I'm just going not to talk about exactly the main ideas of the book, but where the book comes from, so to speak. So my name is Mohamed. Some of you may know me because I saw some familiar faces. I was born in London. My parents are Algerian, and I'm basically my mother tongue is a mix of Arabic and English basically. And when I was 6 months, my parents decided to go to Kuwait, where I spent very early childhood. And one summer, basically what happened is that we were in Algeria, and we couldn't go back there because of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, which is part of what we call the Gulf War. That was 1990 precisely. So we were in Algeria, and then it was the beginning of the civil war, which sometimes some Algerians don't want to call civil war, but anyways. And so basically, my mother wanted to go, my father wanted to stay, and then eventually we left and we went to France. And I, mostly grew up there, and then I was basically playing music. I didn't really care about writing books, reading books, or whatever. And then at some point I met a guy who was my philosophy teacher, and then all of a sudden I had this sort of, I wouldn't say revelation, but something about some sort of key to understand where the hell I ended up. So almost a sort of ethnographic experience, which is how to understand or the mode of thinking that the kind of European tribe where I ended, called the French, how these sort of tools, made me able to have a critical understanding of, where we ended up. So I'm going to talk about this process because this process led, in fact, to this book. And to some extent, this book and the fact that it circulates between different places, histories, and so on, comes from this trajectories of, for sure, displacement, but also of, travel or whatever you want to call it, circulations. So I started sort of working on what maybe call a divide or a boundary, and I would like to start there. I was struck at some point. It was maybe it was 2008, 9, 10, around that time. So I was in Europe, and then people in the media and so on and so forth used to say something that was completely, and I was naively sort of shocked by it, but something very precise, which is the following thing. People were saying, colleagues of mine and friends as well, but also people in television and so on, were saying, we, the West, we separated politics from religion, and Muslims are not able to separate politics from religion, therefore they're dangerous, and so on and so forth. And I was struck by that because it wasn't, to me, very clear, blatant form of racism, because precisely it was talking about politics and religion, and it didn't seem racist, right? And I was also struck by the fact that many intellectuals who were supposed to be, leftists, that some of them, in fact, were saying exactly the same thing, uncritically, as if this went without saying. So one of the first things is I was just trying to understand, where does this come from, and is it true, right? Because precisely what was also interesting is that at that time, I mean, things have changed since then, but at the time there were many people, Muslim or Arab intellectuals, who were going on television, who were basically responding to these people. No, it's not true. Islam is able to separate politics from religion. We can be moderns. We're good guys. And basically, few people were asking the questions to this narrative by saying, but who told you that actually the West did separate politics from religion, right? So I started inquiring into the history of this boundary, right? When and who started saying we, the West, separated politics from religion, and they didn't, right? So this is how it started, and this is why it's a book about, and I know the word is a bit weird, it's called secularization, because secularization is a matrix, or at least a layer of racism that you can only see from the point of view of this history and from the point of view of how Muslims actually are racialized, right? Because precisely what people here and in other places would call whiteness, right? In this specific case, in the specific case of what is called Islamophobia, whiteness presupposes secularization as a norm, right? That is to say, you have to be a secularized subject if you want to be included within, humanity or citizenship in some cases. So this was the starting point. And then I started inquiring historically about that. And, I didn't really want to talk about where my parents come from, which is Algeria, but I actually found, texts of older people, in the 19th century who started saying this. And I actually realized that these people, one of them is Hegel, who's a very important philosopher, were connected, in fact, to the French army who colonized Egypt and then Algeria and so on. So I started sort of mapping these sort of histories, and this is how this book emerged. So the second thing I wanted to say after contextualizing this is that I'm not only trying to talk about our history or our experience, or I'm not trying only to talk about, say, the history of my ancestors or something like that. I'm also trying to think or rethink about the history of the globes, if you will, the history of us here, from this perspective, which is a bit different, right? And so the book is called The States of the Earth, because it says basically two things, which is to some extent the result of this inquiry. The first thing it says, the states of the earth actually means two things. The first thing it means is that it's an inquiry about the physical state in which the earth finds itself, right? Physical state, in the sense that you can talk about the liquid state of something or other forms of states. That is to say, it's another way of describing what is sometimes called the Anthropocene, that is to say, or the climate crisis and so on. But of course, if you use the word state as what it also means, that is to say, as the sovereign state that governs a land and a territory, then of course, to some extent, the argument is in the title, that is to say that the ways in which these political organizations that have colonized land and draw territories on certain maps to sort of say this is our nation states, that these states are precisely partly responsible for what we call the climate crisis. So of course, the way in which you find secularization here again is that it's impossible to understand this political history of our time, so to speak, without understanding what is sometimes called the theological dimension of these states. So why? Most of the time it's because if you look at a state cannot exercise violence without claiming at some point to be absolute, which means that there is always more or less a reference to God, which is one of the ways in which these states legitimize their own power over a population, which happens sometimes when a state says this community, for example, is a threat to the public order, and therefore there's no reasoning or no dialogue possible. We just get rid of them, or they leave, or we kill them. So this moment, which you could call state violence, or in fact sometimes extreme violence, is part, in fact, of this sovereignty, because of this, if you will, theological trace, right, or the trace of God, so to speak. So what I'm trying to call imperiality is precisely, so it's another concept in this book, is linked to colonialism, right? But it's also the fact that you have many ghosts inside states, right? Because states are these sort of monsters who have a memory, and in this memory you have many ghosts, and many of these ghosts are actually emperors. So maybe we'll talk more about that. I just wanted to throw this in the conversation. And so one of the other concepts I'd like to introduce, and maybe we'll talk about it, is the concept of the Secularization. So some of you maybe know the notion of the Anthropocene, which basically is supposed to mean the fact that now the human is a geological force which has an impact on not only the history of the humans, but the history of the climate itself. So I propose the word Secularization partly as a polemical concept, partly as a joke, because you have to sometimes speak in the same, use the language of the people you criticize to actually criticize them. And of course, you know, among you know, eco-critics and so on and so forth, it's been very common to say, look, you know, the climate crisis doesn't come from the human, it's not humanity who did this mess, right? It's specifically Europe at a specific time, more or less during and after industrialization, and of course, predominantly it's capitalism. So I totally agree with this, but in the meantime, I think, and you'll understand why I'm making this connection, I guess, is that most of the time climate activists, when they say that, obliterate or forget the state, right? They say capitalism is bad, sometimes colonialism is bad, right, as part of capitalism, but most of the time people ignore that colonialism came from states, right? It partly comes from the fact that some of these Marxists want to keep the state as a part of the solution instead of analyzing this as part of the problem, right? So part of the reason why I'm bringing this notion of the state at the center of the debate is to try and reflect try to reflect critically and collectively about how these states, how the competition also between these different states, right, have led to a form of globalized violence, which is completely part of where we are now, in my view. So Secularization, I'm going to explain this and then I'll open the discussion from there. Comes from the fact that, of course, there are these political layers, but there is also a metaphysical or even spiritual dimension to this story, which is also why I wrote this book, because I think that in the social sciences or critical theory, this dimension of, I should say, of reality really is difficult to address, engage, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about an example and take it from there. So as I was working, as you probably understood, in by reading historical documents, archives, or sometimes just more or less rare texts of the 19th century, I discovered actually that was an archive which was written by one colonial administrator to another, and that was in what the French by that time called Indochina, actually Cochinchine, right, more precisely, and which is not exactly the same, but this is unimportant here. And in fact, what is interesting is that one of the colonial administrators finds coal supply, right? So that's the late 19th century. And he talks to the governor, actually, and he writes to him, and he says, we found this coal supply, we should secure access to it. One of the problems is that there is so in French it's actually mandarin, I don't know how you would translate that, but it's traditional religious figure, right? Indigenous, so to speak. And so what we know from the archive is that this figure actually tells the colonizer, well, actually, you can't really go beneath the earth because the mine is a dragon. That is to say, the body of the mine is in fact a spiritual body, because if you go there, it means that you actually enter not only the space of a dragon, but the body of the dragon itself. So I already started working on these connections between politics and religion in capitalist modernity before, and then I met this sort of text, trace, and I thought, okay, but so it means that there is something not only about trying to disenchant, as some people said, the world, but the subsoils, that it's to say many layers of the history we're indebted to and that created the world we live in actually happened beneath our feet, right? And I also thought told myself, the notion that extractive capitalism is purely material is actually paradoxically very idealist, right? That is to say, if you actually look at how people deployed extractivist activities, you can't really say that capitalism just appears and just deploys itself by destroying nature like this and so on and so forth, because you actually need to transform forms of life, and you actually need to transform not only the conception of the underworld, but how you relate to the underworld, right? And in many traditions, the underworld is in fact haunted by spirits and most of the time demons, right? And this was a trace, only one trace in fact, of something that puzzled me quite a bit. And I realized actually that this was also a European story in different ways, but it was not completely different in Europe itself, because even during the 17th century and in fact onwards, miners were terrified to go underneath the earth, right? Because precisely they were terrified because they thought that they were going to meet these demons and so on and so forth. So question is, dragons exist, dragons don't exist. You don't really have to decide, but what you know for sure by looking at these histories is that when you start being absolutely sure that there are no demons on the ground, this makes the deployment of fossil capitalism possible. So it means, as a result, that I thought that it was important to talk about a secularization, or to make connections between, if you will, secularization and climate change, because precisely when there is a disenchantment of the subsoils, this makes the development of, if you will, extractive capitalism possible. So yeah, I will end with a question. I guess, many scholars since then, not since then, but since we started talking about the Anthropocene, have said, look, we can't, write the history of modernity without taking into account these, climatic or ecological dimensions of modernity. So, but my question is simply if modernity is the Anthropocene, but if modernity is also secular, or is a form of secularization, then what is the connection between the Anthropocene and the secularization? Which means, is there a secularocene, so to speak? So I guess I'll stop here and I'll say a bit more during the conversation. And yeah, thank you.
We have a copy of the book actually.
Oh,
if you want to read from it at any point, or if you want, yeah.
You want me to read?
Oh, only if you want to.
Who wants me to read? People want me to read. I never did this, honestly, so thank you. And it's the first time I see this copy, actually.
It's the first time you're seeing the book?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So the first pages I already told them. So this is the acknowledgement. I could read this. Okay, I'm going to read the prologue, I guess. Part of the prologue. Yeah, I never did this. Reading myself. In English, you're right.
It's awesome.
Yeah, but I guess it's better because then I understood half of it, so this is better. So, let's go. What is the ecological underside of disenchantment? What took place below our feet when Western powers proclaimed they had liberated us from divine commandments and illusions of transcendence? What were the environmental and planetary consequences of this metaphysical crisis that seems to have struck industrialized Europe during the 19th century? The States of the Earth responds to these questions by revisiting the racial and colonial elements that upheld, like a subterranean and thus invisible architecture, the event that has been called the death of God. That very European wish to abolish every remnant of transcendence in the name of Christ, whose most eminent heralds have been philosophers. What Western sociological thought would later call the secularization of the West is nothing other than a belief in the existence of this world as the only real one, the certainty that it is here below on the earth that salvation can be realized through unlimited enjoyment ensured by continual growth of riches. At the dawn of the 19th century, European empires called for a reform of the religions whose adherents they had given up on trying to convert. This call was an act of secularization in order to abandon the mass conversion of infidels to Christianity, so that for a new generation of colonizers, the spirit of Christ could be better disseminated under, that's nice, thank you, the profane and secular forms of industrial modernities. They thus created a new order. This word order designates how space is reorganized by the imperative to modernize through hierarchies and exclusions. This order, commonly described as a quote-unquote political project, was born from a drive to delineate the borders of politics and its religious other, until then unstable, in order to demand their separation. In this way, the great critics of religion tried to ward off the specters of the divine by abolishing the traces of his so-called law, or to realize a dream of terrestrial immortality in this world through the infinite progress of the human race, an immortality that religions would have projected into an imaginary heaven, or so they say. To command to secularize sounded forth in the voice of a ghost that haunts the body of the modern state, a sort of living dead, a hybrid between being whose violence condemns its indigenous and black victims to existence only within a space situated between life and death. It's actually in existence. Who cares? I mean, I care, but anyways. This body, fundamentally deaf to those who contest it, is that of empire, first animated by a struggle to the death with a rival it calls Islam. It has been obsessed with Jews and Muslims just as strongly as white civilization is still terrorized by blackness. Although treated as an intruder, the Euro-Christian signifier of Islam exposes the spectral body of empire, which implants itself onto the state's organ to weave its flesh. From its metamorphosis was born what Marx called the critique of heaven, the discourse that calls on men to renounce the consolations of the afterlife, but to have faith in the marvels of science and technology, to aspire to salvation here and now, and aim to become divine and eternal in this world. The sacrifice of heaven has overturned the earth. So this is actually, the last sentence I'm going to read. And the sentence means that, and I will stop here, that, which is, maybe my way of making sense of what I read, that, the world we live in, and this is certainly not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that the world we live in is a world where religion has disappeared. I don't think it's true. I'm trying to say that the world we live in has never abandoned salvation or the dream of salvation, right? Because it's just that we don't look for salvation elsewhere or in another world. We just look at salvation in this world. And you can't look at salvation in this world without changing the world and without, in fact, destroying nature. Because if you want to make heaven on earth, you will destroy the earth, and this is what happens in my view. So yeah, for this now I'll really stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation to join you here. It's a pleasure to celebrate the English translation of this book, which I was lucky to read soon after it came out in French, and I really wanted it to get translated because, as Mohamed knows, I'm a tremendous fan. It's really, as someone who's worked on the history of the colonization of Algeria in the 19th century, I'd visited some of these archives and thinkers, but reading this book really transformed my understanding of some fundamental questions, not least, I think, the articulation of the problem of secularization, which I had understood very much in relationship to the dynamics of the racialization of religion and the production of race that is so central to one thread of your argument, but what for me was so revelatory, an aspect of I think the underground that you are the underground of the project of Western modernity that you are revealing is the relationship between that racialization and, in a sense, that exploitation of the environment, right? And that I think you're sort of working with an idea, of the underground, right? It's at once literal and figurative to the extent that this is a kind of an underground of a history that we think we know, and it is this aspect that has been obscured that your book is revealing, but it's also literally the underground. And just to give an example of a moment that really concretized this for me, and that, as you know, I'm continuing to work with, is how, in a sense, yes, we understand in a sense that ideological production of the fanatical Islamic other as what underwrites forms of colonial state violence, right, and the production of an idea of the secular and civilizing colonial state. But you also demonstrate that part of what is part and parcel of these projects is the secularization of mining titles or of land titles that make possible mining, right? So that in a sense, the transformations that you are tracking are always at once ideological and material, right? And there's this relationship between, in a sense, the theory and the practice, which I think is one of the really significant methodological contributions of the book, as well as historical ones. And sort of to follow up on the question that you ended with, I think has to do with really what I see, and I'd like to hear you say more about the kind of particular intervention, even if it's a joke, it's a half joke about the secular scene, how you're offering this up as a kind of supplement that is a critique of the Anthropocene and the capitalist scene, to the extent that it seems that part of what you're saying is that those purportedly critical concepts actually participate in